September 23, 1942. The muddy fields outside Kursk, Soviet Union. Lieutenant Dmitry Petrov watched with quiet satisfaction as his T-34 tank battalion prepared for their scheduled training exercise, their engines consuming precious fuel at an alarming rate that he tried not to dwell upon. The Soviet High Command had assured all field commanders that fuel supplies would be sufficient for the coming winter offensive, despite the loss of the Ukrainian oil fields. They would soon discover how catastrophically wrong that assessment would be. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable tale of how one ordinary beekeeper's desperate experiment with honey-based fuel additives would not only save a Soviet tank division from certain destruction, but also challenge everything both sides thought they knew about the limits of wartime innovation. The pre-dawn darkness blanketed the collective farm 40 kilometers northeast of Kursk. 58-year-old Nikolai Vasilyev moved carefully among his beehives, the familiar buzzing muted by the unseasonable autumn chill. His weathered hands, marked by decades of agricultural work, methodically harvested honeycomb from the wooden boxes. This would be the final harvest before winter, a season that promised to be especially harsh given the German advance towards Stalingrad to the south. Another good yield, despite everything, Nikolai murmured to himself, his breath visible in the cold air. 6 decades of life had etched deep lines across his face, but his eyes remained bright with intelligence. Before the revolution, Nikolai had been a respected chemistry instructor at the University of Moscow, until political suspicion forced him to retreat to his family's ancestral village. Here, he had reinvented himself as a simple beekeeper, his scientific knowledge hidden beneath the persona of an unassuming peasant farmer. The distant rumble of tank engines interrupted his work. The Soviet 19th Armored Division had established a forward resupply depot just 3 kilometers from his farm, their vehicles constantly moving in and out as they prepared for what everyone knew would be a desperate winter campaign. Nikolai had watched with growing concern as the supply trucks arrived with diminishing frequency. Even a simple farmer could see that the fuel situation was becoming dire. Inside his modest wooden cottage, Nikolai carefully sealed the last jar of honey and placed it on a shelf alongside dozens of others. His eyes drifted to the locked door of his back room, his private laboratory where old scientific habits persisted. For 3 years, he had been conducting experiments that would be considered highly suspicious by the authorities. The Soviet state had centralized all research efforts, making independent scientific inquiry effectively illegal without proper authorization. "They would probably shoot me as a saboteur," he muttered, reaching for the hidden key. But if what I suspect is true, his modest laboratory contained equipment salvaged from his university days or constructed from farm implements. Here, Nikolai had been testing various organic compounds, including honey, for properties the Soviet authorities would never have imagined. His notebooks contained careful observations on viscosity, energy potential, and chemical reactions, all disguised as beekeeping records in case of official inspection. The catalyst for his current project had been a chance observation 18 months earlier when he had accidentally spilled honey into the fuel tank of his ancient tractor. Instead of seizing up as expected, the engine had run more smoothly than ever before. Since then, Nikolai had been methodically refining a formula that mixed specific varieties of honey with standard fuel, creating what appeared to be a remarkable extender that improved efficiency. Not perpetual motion, certainly not, Nikolai spoke aloud as he reviewed his notes, but the complex sugars in specific honey varieties, when properly processed, seemed to enhance combustion efficiency beyond anything in the literature. He had documented fuel efficiencies improving by nearly 200% in his tractor engine, but had never dared test it on a larger scale. 20 kilometers away, Major Ivan Zhukov of the Soviet 19th Armored Division stared at the fuel supply reports with growing desperation. A career officer with 14 years of service, Zhukov had survived the purges of the 1930s through a combination of genuine competence and careful political navigation. At 41, his dark hair was already heavily streaked with gray, his face perpetually set in a stern expression that concealed constant anxiety. "Comrade Colonel will not be pleased," remarked Captain Leonid Sokolov, Zhukov's logistics officer, as they reviewed the numbers in the command tent. "We have fuel for perhaps 3 days of normal operations, 4 if we implement severe rationing." Zhukov rubbed his temples. "And our next resupply?" "Delayed indefinitely. The Germans have bombed the rail junction at Voronezh. Nothing is coming through from the Caucasus." The implications were clear. Without fuel, the division's 120 tanks would become nothing more than immobile steel coffins once the German advance reached their position. "The men are already on half rations, the vehicles barely maintained," Zhukov said, his voice low to prevent others from hearing. "If we cannot move when the order comes, the penalty for failure would be severe." NKVD Special Officer Dmitry Kozlov had been assigned to their division specifically to ensure appropriate revolutionary discipline. A political commissar of the most dangerous sort, Kozlov had already ordered the execution of 2 company commanders for perceived defeatism. Sokolov leaned closer. "There may be another option, Comrade Major. My driver mentioned a local farmer who has been experimenting with some kind of fuel alternative. Normally I would dismiss such peasant superstitions, but my driver swears this old man was once a university professor." "A professor hiding as a peasant?" Zhukov raised an eyebrow. "That alone would interest Comrade Kozlov." "Yes, but if there's even a small chance." Sokolov left the sentence unfinished. Zhukov considered for a moment. "Bring this farmer to me, discreetly. If Kozlov hears of this before we determine if there's any merit, we'll all face the firing squad for entertaining bourgeois fantasies." The next morning, Nikolai Vasilyev found himself being escorted to the Soviet command post by 2 stone-faced soldiers. They had arrived at dawn, their manner suggesting that refusal was not an option. Nikolai had barely had time to grab his notebook, carefully disguised as a beekeeping journal, before being loaded into a staff car. Now he sat across from Major Zhukov, trying to maintain the simple demeanor expected of a collective farmer, while assessing how much he could safely reveal. "Comrade Vasilyev," Zhukov began without preamble, "it has come to our attention that you have been conducting unauthorized experiments with fuel alternatives. Under normal circumstances, this would be reported to state security as potential sabotage." Nikolai felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "I am a simple beekeeper, Comrade Major. I know nothing of such matters." "Spare me the performance," Zhukov said sharply. "We know of your background at Moscow University. Your presence here rather than in a labor camp suggests you have friends in significant places, but that protection will evaporate instantly if you lie to me now." Nikolai hesitated, then straightened his posture, allowing his educated bearing to show through for the first time in years. "What do you wish to know, Major?" "Everything about this honey fuel you've developed. My division faces a critical shortage. If there is even a remote chance your formula works, I need to know immediately." "It is not precisely a fuel," Nikolai clarified, his voice taking on the measured cadence of a lecturer. "Rather, it is an additive that significantly enhances combustion efficiency when properly introduced to standard diesel fuel. In my experiments, I've documented efficiency improvements of approximately 200%. Zhukov's eyes narrowed. 200%. "You expect me to believe your concoction can triple the distance our tanks can travel on the same amount of fuel? I have only tested it on my tractor," Nikolai admitted. "The thermodynamic principles should transfer to larger engines, but I cannot guarantee—" "Show me," Zhukov interrupted. "We will test it immediately on one tank. If you are wasting my time with peasant magic, you will be shot. If there is even a partial improvement, you may have saved this entire division." 3 hours later, a single T-34 tank sat idling in a cleared field behind the Soviet encampment. Captain Sokolov had carefully measured exactly 20 liters of standard diesel fuel into its otherwise empty tank, enough for approximately 15 kilometers of operation under normal conditions. Nikolai had been permitted to add 1 liter of his honey-based additive, a golden-brown liquid that had the consistency of thin syrup. "Explain the principles while we wait," Zhukov demanded, as Nikolai completed his work. Nikolai chose his words carefully. The complex sugars in specially cultivated honey varieties, when properly fermented and then treated with certain catalytic compounds, create a substance that enhances the molecular binding energy released during combustion. Additionally, it improves lubrication within the engine, reducing energy lost to friction. Lieutenant Petrov, the tank commander assigned to the test, looked skeptical. "You're saying honey makes the explosion stronger and the engine parts slide better?" A significant oversimplification, but essentially correct, Nikolai replied. Zhukov gestured impatiently. "Begin the test. Lieutenant Petrov will drive the tank along our established perimeter route, maintaining standard speed. We will measure exactly how far it travels before stopping." "There is one additional benefit you should observe," Nikolai added. "The exhaust signature should be significantly reduced. Less visible smoke and lower heat emission." As the tank rumbled away, Zhukov turned to Nikolai. "If this works as you claim, why have you not presented it to Soviet authorities? Such an innovation would be valuable to the war effort." Nikolai met his gaze. "Because, Comrade Major, in 1938, I watched 3 of my colleagues executed for presenting counter-revolutionary scientific theories that contradicted the approved research directions. I decided my contributions would be more valuable if I remained alive." Zhukov did not respond, but his expression suggested he understood all too well. The waiting was interminable. According to calculations, the tank should have exhausted its fuel after approximately 15 kilometers. When Lieutenant Petrov had not returned after 2 hours, Zhukov ordered a search team to follow the test route. They found the tank still running, 47 kilometers from base. "Impossible," breathed Sokolov when the report came in. "That's more than 3 times the expected range." Zhukov's expression hardened into determination. "Comrade Vasiliev, you are now officially requisitioned for special service to the Red Army. You will produce enough of this additive for our entire division immediately. Captain Sokolov, assign a security detail to escort Comrade Vasiliev to collect whatever supplies he needs." "It's not quite so simple," Nikolai interjected. "The formula requires specific honey varieties with particular chemical properties. My own supply is insufficient for more than perhaps 20 tanks." "Then we will find more," Zhukov stated flatly. "The region around Kursk has many beekeepers. We will collect every drop of honey within 50 kilometers." As Nikolai was escorted out, Zhukov turned to Sokolov. "Not a word of this to Commissar Kozlov until we have secured enough supply. He would insist on reporting to Moscow, which would mean delays we cannot afford. We will present him with accomplished facts." On the German side of the Eastern Front, Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Hoffmann of the 7th Panzer Division reviewed intelligence reports with growing frustration. At 46, Hoffmann was an experienced officer who had fought in Poland, France, and now was serving his 2nd winter in Russia. His once immaculate uniform was now weathered, much like the man himself. "Something has changed with the Russian tanks in the Kursk sector," he told his intelligence officer, Hauptmann Dieter Müller. 3 separate reconnaissance patrols have reported unusual activity patterns. They're moving more frequently but producing less visible exhaust. Müller, a sharp-featured man with penetrating blue eyes, nodded. "The reports are consistent, Herr Oberstleutnant. Russian armor is operating far more extensively than fuel supplies should permit. Our intelligence indicated severe shortages throughout the Soviet 19th Armored Division just 2 weeks ago." "Could our intelligence be wrong?" Hoffmann asked, studying the map of Russian positions. "Unlikely. We captured a Russian supply officer 4 days ago who confirmed the shortage before he died. Something has changed in the interim." Hoffmann tapped the map thoughtfully. "New supply lines, perhaps?" "Air reconnaissance shows no significant transport activity," Müller replied. "It's as if they've somehow stretched their existing supplies beyond what should be physically possible." "Nothing is beyond physical possibility, Hauptmann," Hoffmann said sharply. "There must be a rational explanation. Perhaps they've been hoarding reserves and are now deploying them to create the impression of strength." "There is another possibility," Müller suggested hesitantly. "Our technical intelligence unit has intercepted radio communications, suggesting some sort of new fuel additive being distributed among Soviet tank units. The references are deliberately obscured, but they mention something called Project Nectar." Hoffman raised an eyebrow. Nectar? Like honey? Possibly just a code name, Müller shrugged, but unusual enough to note. Inform Berlin, Hoffman decided, and double reconnaissance efforts in the Kursk sector. If the Russians have developed some new fuel technology, High Command will want to know immediately. Meanwhile, Nikolai Vasiliev's simple farm had been transformed into a makeshift production facility. Soviet soldiers had requisitioned every piece of suitable equipment from surrounding farms. Dozens of Red Army technicians worked under Nikolai's supervision, carefully following his production protocol. More significantly, the NKVD had organized the requisition of honey supplies from every beekeeper within a 100-kilometer radius, creating a massive stockpile. Not all of it was suitable for Nikolai's purpose. He carefully tested each batch, selecting only those with the precise chemical properties his formula required. The unsuitable honey was distributed as rations to grateful soldiers, improving morale as an unexpected side benefit. Major Zhukov could no longer hide the operation from Commissar Kozlov, who had initially been furious at the unauthorized project. However, after witnessing demonstration tests himself, Kozlov's anger transformed into opportunistic enthusiasm. Moscow must be informed immediately, Kozlov declared. This innovation will bring great glory to our division. With respect, Comrade Commissar, Zhukov countered carefully. Informing Moscow now would likely result in the project being transferred elsewhere. We would lose our advantage just as we're preparing to face the German winter offensive. Kozlov's thin lips curved in a calculating smile. You misunderstand me, Comrade Major. I intend to inform Moscow after we have achieved a significant victory using this new technology. The political value will be much greater. The self-serving logic was impeccable. A success would reflect well on Kozlov. A failure could be blamed on the division command. Zhukov understood the game all too well, but was relieved to maintain control of the project. Production continued day and night. Nikolai worked to the point of exhaustion, teaching Soviet technicians the precise formulation process. Within a week they had produced enough of the honey-based additive to supply the entire division, with reserves for another 2 weeks of operations. The effects were immediately apparent. Soviet tanks began conducting extended patrols far beyond what German intelligence expected possible. More importantly, the reduced exhaust signature made them harder to spot, especially in the early morning fog that frequently blanketed the region. Lieutenant Dmitry Petrov, whose tank had been the first test subject, became one of the most enthusiastic proponents of what the soldiers now called honey juice. His tank crew reported not only extended range, but improved engine performance and fewer mechanical issues. It's as if the engine is happier, Petrov told his fellow officers during a briefing. Smoother operation, less vibration, and we can maintain higher speeds without overheating. The strategic implications were significant. The 19th Armored Division now effectively had triple the operational range of any other Soviet unit, allowing for unprecedented mobility on the battlefield. Zhukov began planning operations that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. On the German side, Oberstleutnant Hoffmann's concerns grew as more reports confirmed the unusual Soviet tank activity. Berlin had responded to his initial reports with skepticism, suggesting that Russian forces were simply being more efficient with existing supplies, a notion Hoffmann found laughable given his experience with Soviet logistics. They're planning something, he told his staff during an evening briefing. These extended patrols, the reduced visibility signatures, they're testing capabilities for a larger operation. Hauptmann Müller had continued investigating the mysterious Project Nectar references. We've captured 3 Russian soldiers in the last week, he reported. 2 were ordinary infantry and knew nothing. The third was a tank crewman who mentioned something interesting before succumbing to his wounds. He said their tanks were running on bee magic. Bee magic? Hoffmann repeated incredulously. His exact words, Müller confirmed. Initially, I dismissed it as delirium, but considering the code name Nectar, you believe they're actually using honey as a fuel component. Hoffmann's tone was skeptical but not dismissive. He had learned in Russia that desperation often bred innovation. Not as fuel itself, Müller clarified, more likely as an additive or extender. The chemistry could potentially work, Honey contains complex sugars that, if properly processed, might enhance combustion efficiency. Hoffman considered this. If true, it would explain their extended operational range. More concerning, it would represent a significant advancement we need to counter. He made a decision. Send a special reconnaissance team. I want samples of whatever the Russians are using, and I want prisoners who can explain it. While German intelligence scrambled to understand the Soviet advantage, Nikolai Vasiliev faced a different problem. The honey supplies were running low, with winter approaching and no more harvests possible until spring. We need at least 12,000 more liters of suitable honey to maintain operations through winter, he explained to Major Zhukov and Commissar Kozlov. At current consumption rates, we'll exhaust our supply within 20 days. The state will provide, Kozlov declared with bureaucratic confidence. I've already requested honey shipments from other regions. With respect, Comrade Commissar, Nikolai replied carefully. Not all honey is suitable. The specific chemical properties required are found only in honey produced from certain wildflowers that grow in this region and parts of Ukraine. Zhukov understood the implications immediately. And Ukraine is currently under German occupation. Precisely, Nikolai confirmed. The best source would be the apiaries near Kharkov, but accessing those is obviously impossible. Kozlov's expression darkened. Are you suggesting we cannot proceed because of geographical limitations, Professor? Such defeatist thinking is problematic. Nikolai recognized the dangerous tone. Not at all, Comrade Commissar. I am merely explaining the challenge so we can develop appropriate solutions. Perhaps we could synthesize the necessary compounds. How quickly? Zhukov asked. With proper laboratory equipment? Perhaps 2 weeks to develop a prototype, another month for production. Nikolai knew this was optimistic, but survival demanded hope. Unacceptable, Kozlov snapped. The offensive cannot wait. We will find another solution. He turned to Zhukov. What about captured German fuel supplies? Could we extend those with the remaining additive? Before Zhukov could answer, a commotion outside interrupted the meeting. Captain Sokolov burst into the command tent, his expression urgent. German Special Forces, Comrade Major. They struck one of our forward refueling stations, 3 tanks destroyed, several honey additive containers stolen. They took prisoners as well, including 2 technicians who worked directly with Comrade Vasiliev. The implications were immediately clear. The Germans were now aware of the Soviet advantage and taking concrete steps to understand and potentially neutralize it. Across the front line, Oberstleutnant Hoffmann examined the captured Soviet containers with intense interest. German chemical specialists had been flown in from Berlin specifically to analyze the mysterious substance. Preliminary analysis confirms it's organic-based, reported Dr. Ernst Weber, the lead scientist. Primarily derived from honey but significantly modified through a complex chemical process. The exact mechanism is fascinating. It appears to alter the molecular structure of the diesel fuel when mixed, creating a more efficient combustion matrix. Can we reproduce it? Hoffmann asked, cutting to the practical concern. Weber hesitated. With time, possibly. The formula is elegant but relies on specific chemical compounds found in the original honey. We would need to isolate those compounds first. What about using the captured supply? Hauptmann Müller suggested. We seized nearly 200 liters. Enough for limited testing, Hoffmann agreed. Begin with 1 Panzer company. I want comparative performance data within 48 hours. Weber looked uncomfortable. There is a risk, Herr Oberstleutnant. Without fully understanding the chemical properties, using it in our engines could cause damage. A calculated risk we must take, Hoffmann decided. The Russians have gained a significant advantage. We must understand it and counter it quickly. The captured Soviet technicians proved less helpful than hoped. Both maintained they knew only the mixing ratios, not the fundamental chemistry behind the formula. Hoffmann suspected they were being truthful. The Soviet approach to compartmentalizing information would limit technical knowledge to only those who absolutely required it. Nevertheless, the German tests proceeded. 1 company of 5 Panzer IV tanks was selected for the experiment, each receiving a carefully measured amount of the captured Soviet additive mixed with standard German diesel fuel. The results were immediate and impressive. The test tanks reported significant increases in range and performance, with fuel efficiency improvements measured at approximately 280%, even better than Soviet results due to the superior baseline efficiency of German engines. Hoffmann immediately reported the findings to Berlin, emphasizing both the strategic threat and opportunity the discovery represented. The response was swift. All captured Soviet honey fuel was to be secured for priority use by special panzer units, and German chemical experts were to be given every resource needed to reverse engineer the formula. For 2 weeks, an unusual calm settled over the front lines near Kursk. Both sides were reassessing their strategies in light of the new fuel technology. Soviet forces continued producing the honey additive at maximum capacity, but conservation measures were implemented to extend the dwindling supply. German units carefully rationed their captured stocks, while their scientists worked frantically to reproduce the formula. The stalemate was broken on November 12th, when Soviet intelligence reported a massive German armored column moving toward their position from the southwest, directly from the direction of the Ukrainian beekeeping regions. Major Zhukov immediately grasped the strategic intent. "They're not just coming to attack our position," he told his officers. "They're moving to secure the Ukrainian apiaries before winter fully sets in. If they control those honey sources, they can produce the additive at scale." The implications were dire. If Germany gained the ability to extend its fuel supplies threefold, the entire strategic balance on the Eastern Front would shift dramatically. The Reich's chronic fuel shortages had been one of its most significant vulnerabilities. "We must intercept them before they reach the apiaries," Zhukov decided. "This is no longer just about our division's advantage. It's about denying a critical resource to the enemy." Commissar Kozlov, for once, was in complete agreement. "Moscow has authorized a special operation. We will deploy immediately." The plan was daring. Using their fuel advantage, the 19th Armored Division would execute a sweeping flanking maneuver, cutting off the German advance before it could reach the Ukrainian beekeeping centers. It would require a 300-kilometer push through contested territory, possible only because of their extended range. Lieutenant Dmitry Petrov's tank company was assigned the critical task of serving as the spearhead. They would move ahead of the main force, securing key crossroads and establishing forward positions. "We'll be operating well beyond normal support range," Zhukov warned them during the final briefing. "If the honey additive fails for any reason, you will be stranded behind enemy lines." Petrov straightened. "We understand the risks, Comrade Major. My crew has complete confidence in Professor Vasiliev's formula." Nikolai, who had been invited to the briefing, felt a complex mix of pride and concern. His scientific creation, developed initially from simple curiosity, had become the linchpin of a major military operation. The responsibility was enormous. "There is one additional factor you should be aware of," Nikolai told the assembled officers. "Temperature affects the formula's efficiency. As we move into colder regions, you may notice slightly reduced performance, perhaps 10 to 15% less range in sub-zero conditions." Zhukov nodded grimly. "Noted. All units will adjust calculations accordingly." The operation launched before dawn on November 14th. 112 Soviet tanks moved out in carefully coordinated groups, their reduced exhaust signatures helping to conceal the massive movement from German aerial reconnaissance. For 3 days, they advanced through territory the Germans believed was beyond Soviet operational range. The surprise was nearly total. German forward units were overwhelmed before they could report contact, allowing the Soviet force to maintain momentum. On the German side, Oberstleutnant Hoffmann received the first alarming reports with disbelief. "Impossible," he told Hauptmann Müller. "Our intelligence confirmed the Soviet 19th Armored Division was still in their original position as of yesterday." "The reconnaissance flights may have been deceived," Müller suggested. "If they're using the honey additive throughout their force, the reduced exhaust signature would make aerial observation difficult, especially in the current cloudy conditions." Hoffmann quickly reassessed the situation. If they've somehow managed to extend their operational range this dramatically, our advance toward the beekeeping regions is now vulnerable. They could potentially cut off our entire column. "Should we abort the operation?" Müller asked. Hoffmann considered carefully. "No, we accelerate it. Order maximum speed toward the objective. If we can secure the apiaries before the Russians intercept us, we'll have accomplished our primary mission." The race was now direct and explicit, both forces driving toward the same objective, each understanding its strategic significance. What might have seemed absurd months earlier, armies competing for control of beehives, had become deadly serious. On November 17th, the two forces converged near a small Ukrainian village 30 kilometers north of the main beekeeping region. Lieutenant Petrov's forward company was the first to make contact with German armor. "Enemy sighted," Petrov reported over the radio. "Approximately 40 Panzer-IV advancing rapidly from the south. They appear to be the vanguard of a larger force." "Engage and delay," came Zhukov's immediate order. "The main division is 2 hours behind you. Hold them as long as possible." Petrov's 12 tanks took defensive positions along a ridgeline overlooking the German approach route. The odds were daunting, but their elevated position provided a significant advantage. "Target their fuel tanks specifically," Petrov instructed his gunners. "If they're using captured honey additive, even a minor hit could ignite it." The ensuing battle was fierce, but one-sided. The Soviet tanks, firing from concealed positions against German units in the open, destroyed 17 panzers while losing only 3 of their own. More importantly, they delayed the German advance by nearly 4 hours, enough time for the main Soviet force to arrive. When Major Zhukov's full division crested the ridge behind Petrov's embattled company, the remaining German vanguard began a fighting retreat. Hoffmann, receiving reports from the field, recognized that the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. "The Russians have committed their entire armored strength to this operation," he told his staff. "They understand exactly what we're attempting." The German force now faced a critical decision: continue the advance toward the beekeeping regions and risk being surrounded, or withdraw to more defensible positions. Hoffmann, ever the pragmatist, chose the latter. "The apiaries are now a secondary objective," he radioed to his forward commanders. "Primary objective is preserving our armored capability. Execute a phased withdrawal to position Brunhilde." The Soviet forces pursued the retreating Germans, but were hampered by their own logistics concerns. Despite the extended range provided by the honey additive, they were now operating at the extreme edge of their capability. Any tanks that exhausted their enhanced fuel would become stranded. Zhukov made the difficult decision to halt the pursuit after 30 kilometers. "We've achieved our primary objective," he announced. "The beekeeping regions are secured. We will establish a defensive perimeter and await resupply." The battle, quickly dubbed the Honey Run by Soviet troops, represented a significant tactical victory. The Germans had lost 34 tanks and failed to secure their objective. More importantly, the strategic value of Nikolai Vasiliev's honey-based fuel additive had been definitively proven in combat conditions. In the aftermath, Nikolai found himself summoned to Moscow. His initial fear of punishment for unauthorized research quickly gave way to astonishment, as he was escorted not to Lubyanka prison, but to a scientific institute where he was introduced as the creator of Formula NV, Nikolai Vasiliev. "Your innovation has been deemed of critical importance to the Soviet war effort," explained the institute director, academician Sergei Lebedev. "You will be given all necessary resources to perfect the formula and develop mass production techniques." Over the following months, Nikolai worked with Soviet scientists to refine his formula and establish production facilities near the Ukrainian beekeeping regions. By the spring of 1943, Soviet tank units throughout the Eastern Front were receiving allocations of the honey-based additive, significantly extending their operational capabilities. The Germans never fully replicated the formula, though not for lack of effort. Their chemical analysis identified most of the key components, but the specific enzymatic processes used in Nikolai's method remained elusive. More importantly, they lacked access to the specific honey varieties required for optimal results. In April 1943, Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote in his personal journal, "The greatest ironies of war are often the simplest. We have the most advanced chemical industry in Europe, yet find ourselves outmaneuvered because Russian peasants discovered that properly processed honey can extend fuel supplies. History will find this either amusing or entirely fitting. that nature's simple product proved more valuable than synthetic chemistry. The story of the honey fuel became legendary within Soviet ranks, though official histories would later downplay its significance, preferring to emphasize the triumph of centralized Soviet science rather than a former professor's independent innovation. Nikolai Vasilyev received the Order of the Red Star for his contribution, but remained working at the institute until the war's end. Lieutenant Dmitry Petrov, whose tank company had played such a crucial role in the Honey Run, survived the war and occasionally spoke of those remarkable days when Soviet tanks seemed to run on an inexhaustible supply of fuel. In his later years, he would tell his grandchildren, "It wasn't just the extra distance that mattered. It was knowing we had overcome something the Germans thought impossible. Sometimes in war, the greatest advantage isn't a bigger gun or thicker armor. It's solving a problem your enemy believes cannot be solved." The beekeeping regions near Kharkov became a carefully guarded military resource for the remainder of the war. Special agricultural units were assigned to maintain and expand the apiaries, ensuring a steady supply of the specific honey varieties needed for the fuel additive. Major Ivan Zhukov, the officer who had taken the initial risk of testing Nikolai's formula, rose to become a general by war's end. When asked about the honey run in a 1969 interview, he smiled slightly and said, "Innovation often comes from unexpected sources. The greatest scientific breakthrough of the war didn't emerge from a grand laboratory, but from a simple farm where a man had the courage to ask questions no one else thought to ask." The formula itself remained classified until 1991, when Soviet archives were partially opened following the collapse of the USSR. By then, petroleum chemistry had advanced far beyond the wartime innovation, making the specific technique more of historical curiosity than practical value. Nevertheless, certain aspects of Nikolai Vasilyev's enzymatic approach to fuel enhancement would later influence developments in biofuel research in the early 21st century. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph came from Nikolai himself, who in his final academic paper, published shortly before his death in 1967, wrote, "The distinction between legal and illegal knowledge is entirely artificial. Nature reveals her secrets to those who ask the right questions, regardless of whether they possess official permission to ask them." And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.